In this lesson, we will talk about proximity and how it can drive the eye path of the viewer. Okay, so let's talk about what proximity is. Proximity is the relationship of how objects fit together, big, small, nearby, and distant. So in this first example here, I'm just over here in our third principle of proximity on example 1. We're talking about proximity as far as big and small goes. So we have lots of different size differences between these images, bits of text that almost form an image because they create a block, and then just the design elements we have here, the circles and these little squares, and really even the grid that you see in the background is almost just like one big square. So what's happening with these images is that they've been laid out in a specific grid that relies on proximity to really just carry your eye through the composition. Now, besides the proximity of all of the objects, we also have the motion that they have been animated with, and that gives you a little bit more of a direction with your eye path. So let's talk about what eye path is. It's one of the most important elements of composition. Now, it sometimes can be less important in motion graphics simply because we don't have to rely on static design to convey our message. So we have the ability to change what's on screen, and that's what drives our eye path. But sometimes in a more complex design, you still need to keep eye path in mind. So eye path is simply where the viewer's eye is led to, and that can be created through your motion or by the way that your images have been laid out. So this composition is really relying on both of those. So as I scrub through here, you see that we have this little person kind of popping up here first, and then the name and image come next, and then we get this larger image here on the right, and then this image begins to reveal back towards the left where the profile area is. So because of the way that these images have been laid out and because of the motion they've been animated, your eye path really just goes in this clockwise motion around the composition, which is exactly what we want. We want these people to start out by seeing the profile of this person, and then the pieces of artwork that they've created, and then just kind of ending again back on the person. Now, as a general rule, whenever people see images of people, they have a tendency to look at the eyes of that person. So even though this box here is a small square, it's still one of the first things that you're drawn to. You're also drawn there because of this bit of text, and it really just serves to frame this picture. And again, one of the ways that you're drawn to it is because it simply is revealed first. So simply because that comes on first, you're still looking at this image whenever this image comes on. So if you had a really long time to reveal all of these elements, you may even leave these on longer by themselves before you would introduce anything else. Now in this composition, we move on to really another profile of another person. So you have limited time. So really by using all of those elements together, the proximity of these elements drives that eye path along with the animation, and we're able to move on from this composition to the next while still conveying a meaningful message that gives you all of those elements in the order that you want people to read them. Now let's talk about proximity in a little bit of a different context. We'll come over here and double click proximity 2. And if I scrub through this, we start to see proximity in a little bit of a different light. This is proximity more as it relates to distance. So we start out here with the first element of our composition being this little speech bubble here on the left. So as we scrub through, even though this is still closer, because it moves out of focus and so it feels as if the distance is pretty large between these two elements, we begin to look at this element simply because it's still in focus. So really the depth of field here is what's giving us that change in proximity that feels like there has been distance created between these elements. And also just having these other two elements in the background helps to push that distance further. This purple speech bubble that you see in the back has the most blur of all. So it really just helps to drive your eye, and you just realize how much space is actually in this composition. So it's really the blur that's creating that. And you can see that as I scrub through this, that distance is what drives your eye. So as this starts to move off the screen and become blurred, our eye automatically wants to move to this next pop of color that's in focus. So you can use proximity as distance as well as that relationship between big and small to drive where your viewer's eye is going to move. Now, let's move on to our third example. This is going to be referring to proximity as a relationship between big and small. But I want to talk a little bit about alignment and how that affects your composition. So I have these 3 empty compositions here that are just labeled box 1, 2, and 3 that are here on this background. So what I want to do is just drop some images into these different boxes. So let's come down here to our assets and drop that down. And we want to look inside of the graphics and images, and I'm just going to pick a few random images that you see here inside of the graphics and images. So let's just double click into box 1, and we'll kind of zoom in there so we can see that a little bit better. And let's just grab this middle image there and drop that on. Now this is going to be quite a bit larger than what we need it to be, so you can just grab the edge, hold shift, and scale that down to make it fit just a little bit better. And it's okay that this is blurry. It's going to be a lot smaller on our main composition. So this is really what I want that to look like. So let's come back out here and you can see how small that actually is there. Now let's go up to box 2, double click that, and we'll grab a different image, maybe this one here, put that inside of our box, and I'm just scaling that down. Okay, and then we'll do it for our third box as well. Just come up here, double click box 3, and let's grab this image. We'll put that inside of it and scale that down. So what we've created is really almost a grid that we can populate with any kind of images. Because this has been set up in such a way that we can change those images out, you could use whatever images you want. But the important thing is that we've created a grid through the proximity of these different boxes. So I can align these in different ways, kind of switch this around here, all kind of focusing on the way that these interact here in the middle. And I can select all of those, maybe move this a little bit more towards the middle of the whole composition, or maybe bring this down into the lower left hand corner, and maybe this would be a place that you would add a piece of text. So I have this little logo here. I can grab that. Maybe I want to add that in right there just to kind of complete the 4 elements that you see there. And you may want to change the scale of that a little bit. And one of the things I always want to be sure of whenever I'm using After Effects is just the way that it recognizes the outside edges of certain kinds of files. So this is an Illustrator file, and what these edges are the edges of my artboard. And as I bring this in here, I'm tempted to align this similarly to the edges of my rectangles. But if you look at this without anything selected, this doesn't feel like it's really aligned with any of the images we have there. And that's simply because we were relying on the artboard edges, which really don't even exist inside of After Effects. So you want to make sure that you bring this kind of more down into this area here, and you're not relying on those non-existent edges as a means of a guide, because they're really not there at all once you have not selected anything, once you would maybe start to just render this out. So just keep that in mind whenever you're working with those different types of files. So as a rule, people's eyes are going to fluctuate all around a composition like this. So using this grid to kind of push the sizes of these different images is going to drive where your viewer's eye is. So right now I kind of have these sizes laid out beforehand just because of the size of the composition. I haven't changed the scale of any of these compositions themselves. So knowing that I always want to put my most important picture into this composition is just going to help me to be a little bit better of a designer by planning that out beforehand. Now I could come in there and scale this up a little bit, but because of the way we set up the compositions, this one is going to be a little bit blurry if I do that. So I just want to keep in mind that my most important picture is always going to go in that bigger composition. And just by using that element of proximity and alignment as a way of organizing them, it's going to make my composition stronger. And one of the last things I want to talk about in this talk about proximity is tension. So tension is a balance maintained in artistic work between opposing forces or elements. So basically what it means is the whole really crux of what we're operating on here is the tension that's created right here in the middle. So I'm kind of just operating here off the idea that there's almost like an invisible crosshair, and the tension that's created by these elements being close together here in the middle is really what makes this feel like it has balance. If all of these were similar in size, we'll just ignore that this gets a little bit blurry. This just doesn't feel as interesting anymore. If I come in here, kind of move that around, this just really begins to feel a little bit more boring. So just by varying those sizes and watching out for the proximity of how close they are to each other, we've created that tension right there in the middle that forces the viewer's eye around the composition. So this just isn't as appealing as what we had earlier. So I'm going to undo that and bring it back to those sizes that just felt like they were being pushed further. Now, one of the things you want to keep in mind whenever you're working with motion design is that people aren't going to be able to get up really close to the design that you're creating. You want to make sure that you're looking at this at 100% of how big it's going to be viewed so that you know that things are readable. Now, the way that this has been designed, this is probably a little bit too small. It's hard for me to tell, and I don't have a lot of contrast between the background and the top of this image. So it might be a good idea in that case to choose a different photograph, or maybe scale this one up a little bit. Push it up a little there so that there's just a little bit of a darker value there at the top of that photo. So when I come back out, there's a little more contrast between the background and that picture. So it just doesn't feel like there's such a no really edge there to be seen. So in this lesson, we learned about how proximity has so much to do with where you want to drive the viewer's eye, and how a good implementation of proximity has the power to clearly communicate a complex message.